Welcome to the final component of Chapter 4, the Mycenaeans. As always, make sure you're looking at the themes and topics that we've been looking at for the whole chapter, and you've been making the connections amongst them, as well as a timeline that I'd love for you to keep looking at. Now we're looking at Mycenaean art, and I've put 1700 as a date. Some historians will say 1600, but there seems to have been some presence on the mainland from as early as about 1700. Now the era that we're looking at more specifically is a little bit closer to 1400 to 1200, but it's kind of the span of the Mycenaeans in this timeline that we want to regard as we look at this section of the lesson. So let's look at the background. First of all, the origins of the Mycenaeans is another subject of debate, so we don't really know. But certainly their presence was on the mainland pretty much about the same time as the Old Palace period on the island of Crete. So chronologically, they're occurring at the same time, right? Now, they also probably made early contact with Minoan Crete, and that certainly influenced the ideas going both ways. And in a little bit, when we look at some of the work, you'll see how the Minoan figure type, for example, is taken up by the Mycenaeans as well. Now, they're called Mycenaean because of the important site of Mycenae that has been excavated, and the red arrow is pointing to that in the map on the left. Now, as with the Minoans and the Cyclades Islands, archaeology is key for us, and this is generally the case for all of art history, but primarily in this region that we're looking at. And you already see Heinrich Schliemann image right there, and we'll talk about him in just a second. So some of the records that we have with the Mycenaeans, not very extensive written records. Most of what we have are bureaucratic documents. And from these texts, we have information about the economic system of the palaces. These texts also mention kings, so we know that the palaces were ruled by kings. And some of the later texts also mention gathering of armies in preparation for expected attack. So we know that they were rather aggressive and that they were also being attacked, which meant they would have to develop ways to defend themselves. Now, Homer, we've mentioned before in the very beginning of chapter 4. Homer actually refers to this Mycenae as rich in gold, and we'll see a gold mass towards the end of the lesson here. Now, from Homer, we get the impression that the lord of Mycenae, who was supposed to be Agamemnon, had a lot of influence. He gathered armies. He brought together kings to be able to fight a war against Troy. Okay, and so all of these, again, are they part of Homer's myth and his stories that have been written down, or is there some truth? Well, that's where Schliemann will come into place in just a second. But what we do know about the Mycenaeans is that they were very wealthy. This is a rich civilization. They had enough manpower to build very large stone structures. They had lots of jewelry, lots of weapons. A lot of these are also buried with the kings that have been excavated. They also traded quite largely and widely with Egypt, Asia Minor, other parts of Italy, the Baltic area. So, they have the resources, they have the manpower, they certainly have the stability within the culture to do and create and pretty much thrive and prosper. Now, Schliemann is working in this region between 1870 and 1890, so towards the end of the 19th century. He's actually a German businessman and a scholar, and he was infatuated and obsessed with Homer and all of his stories and all of his writings and references. And he really believed and studied the geography in the Iliad, excuse me, and believed that there was a place that he could find. And he eventually excavates Troy, which is indicated by the yellow arrow, as well as Mycenae, indicated by the red arrow. One of the places that Schliemann excavated was in Turin, and this is a citadel of Turin. It is quite impressive, and I want you to look at another image before we actually talk about it in more detail. Here is the newer photograph that's included in the newest edition of the book. But I want you to look at it. So what features do you notice? What conclusions can you make just by looking at this aerial perspective? Right. What can you say about the size? Do you notice the walls? Do you see the different areas that might have had different functions? Now I want you to think about, how does this Mycenaean citadel that you're looking at, how is it different from the palace at Knossos? Here they are together to make it a little bit easier to recall the information. So when you look at Knossos in the top left, and you look at the citadel on the bottom right, do you notice how Knossos has no fortifications? Remember we said this? Now the citadel, the Mycenaean citadel, has heavy fortifications. Believe it or not, those walls that would have surrounded the site were actually 20 feet in thickness. So you can think about the Mycenaeans, as we mentioned, right, that they are fearing gathering armies in preparation for attack. So they are aggressive, they're being attacked as well, they need to be protected. They're not an island surrounded by sea, right? Whereas Knossos with the Minoans, they had these open spaces, right? They didn't need to be defensive because they weren't attacked, right? They weren't needing to always be, ready for invaders to come in. So this is a really significant difference between these two Aegean cultures that we must know of right away. Here is another major excavation by Schliemann, and this is a citadel at Mycenae, actually, what he would have called Agamemnon's Mycenae. And after he successfully found this and excavated here, he thought, the grave sites of Homer's Greek royal family that are mentioned, they should be here. However, as we'll find out later, the graves that were found here were a little bit earlier than the era that Schliemann was actually looking for. But here it is, what it looks like today, and what a reconstruction of it would have looked like in its original construction, in its original day. So take a look at the various areas, take a look at the various levels of buildings. Notice the 20 feet thick walls that surround the entire citadel, the various areas of functionality, and then that circular part in the lower right hand area of the screen, that's the graves of the kings. That's where they would have been buried, and we'll look into this a little bit more as well, but it's just impressive to see it and kind of try to imagine it as in its original time, right? This is what the people would have seen. This is where the kings would have been living and administering and governing from. Let's go back to the citadel at Turin. Now, Homer would have called this a city of great walls, understandably, as you can see in the image with these thick fortifications around it. The beginning of this construction was around 1400 BC, and then it was burnt down around 1250 and 1200, when we believe some invaders had come in, and we'll talk about that at the very end of this lesson. Now, the Greeks of the historical age, the ones in chapter 5 that we're going to look at, they were impressed with this material that we're looking at right now. And they actually were really intrigued with the process of construction. And we're going to take a look at that just for a few moments here. When we get closer up into one of the areas, and here we're looking at a corbel vaulted gallery in the citadel, we want to get introduced to this new term here, corbelled arch gallery, or corbel vaulted gallery, pretty much implying the same thing. And you can see what that construction looks like with the image on the left, kind of the diagram right there. They're basically large blocks of stone that are piled up in a horizontal format, of course, and they're cantilevered inward until the two of them meet in that pointed arch. Okay, so of course very precise, very thoughtfully done. There is no mortar that's used, as you can clearly see from the image on the right. So the vault is held in place only by the weight of the blocks and by the smaller stones that are used as wedges. In some instances, there might be a little bit of clay that fills some of the empty areas, but pretty much it's the form of the block itself and the smaller pieces that are wedged in between. Now, I've also got on there Cyclopean masonry, and this is because the historical Greeks, right, the ones from chapter 5 that we'll meet soon, what they thought was this massive construction was only possible if a monster like Cyclops had actually created it. Right? So clearly that's not the case, but the term Cyclopean masonry continued to be used throughout history with archaeologists, art historians, architectural historians as well, referring to these, roughly cut stone blocks that form these massive fortifications, these massive walls. And so now we know of another method of spanning a passageway, right? When we looked at the Stonehenge in chapter 1, that was a post and lintel construction, which is a top image here labeled A. And we just encountered the corbelled arch or the corbelled vault, which is what's been used with the Mycenaean citadels. And then eventually when we get to the Romans, we'll look at the rounded arch. So just kind of to be aware of these three architectural methods of spanning a passageway, which are really significant because they pretty much form the framework of everything else that's going to come around it, on top of it, and so on. Let's keep going and look at how the Mycenaeans strategically constructed their citadel. Okay, the approach ramp to the entire citadel is this narrow path, and you can see that marked up with a red arrow on the slide. Now the main gate, marked by the yellow arrow here, is really, really narrow. What that means is it doesn't allow a whole big troops, right, a big army to storm the citadel and attack it and topple it and bring it down. And the attackers would have to, if they really dared actually go beyond the main gate, would need to be funneled into maybe one or two individuals at a time. And even trying to get to the Megaron, kind of one of the most important places of the palace right there in the center, that was also, going through narrow passageways and trying to, turn right, turn left. So it wasn't easy to find, right? So very strategically created. The other very intelligent thing with this plan is that the approach ramp has it in such a way that the army that would be approaching it would have their right side, which is the unshielded side, right, the vulnerable side, the open side, that would be open to the Mycenaean defenders that would have been on top of those thick, heavy walls. So basically, even if they dared attack, they're in a position of vulnerability, right, and weakness. And on the left side, I did kind of move up this plan of the palace so that you guys can see it as it relates directly to the ground plan. We will see this image later. This is the warrior vase, but I just wanted to show you how the exposed right side of the approaching enemy soldiers would have been, right? So normally at this time, the soldiers in general are holding the shield on the left side, and then the right side is exposed. So you can imagine any enemies of the Mycenaeans attacking it would be already, even before any kind of confrontation inside the citadel, would already be in a power of weakness and probably defeat. The most important element, the most important feature of the Mycenaean citadel was the Megaron. This is basically the throne room and the reception hall of the citadel. So very, very impressive. Now, the palace, we saw from the outside, right, the citadel is pretty severe and harsh and heavy and rough, right, with its stone blocks and the cyclopean masonry. But when you come inside, it's certainly something very different. This is another restored view of the Megaron that we're kind of pointing to here. So you can see it would have had a central hearth, right? And these four very Minoan looking style wooden columns. You've seen those before in the Knossos Palace. But here it is, right? This very glamorous, beautiful ornamentation of the interior of the citadel, trying to kind of almost like lessen the severe impact of the outside. So the outside could be harsh and severe and commanding and ward off enemy invaders and also instill fear in any guests that are also coming in. But inside, right, this kind of brighter colors are certainly a contrast to the outside. However, they still serve to reinforce the power of the ruler, right? His capacity to, bring in the material resources, his ability to use, these creatures on the walls and these paintings to impress, to, show his power, his wealth, his might, and so on. Things we've certainly seen before. We've seen them in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, with the Minoans, and here again we see it with the Mycenaeans. Back back outside of the citadel. Now we're at Mycenae with this one. We're about to enter it, so we want to see what does it look like when you're actually about to enter into one of these citadels. Now remember, right, the approach was designed to make a difficult attack. It was also meant to impress you and to impress upon you kind of the power that you would be meeting or encountering when you eventually got to the Megaron, if you were indeed coming to visit the ruler, right? So here it is, the Lion Gate, as we're about to approach it. Now on one side, on the left side, it's this huge, natural rocky outcropping, and you've got the wall built on top of that. On the right side are those big blocks, the large blocks. So if you were actually going to head into the Lion Gate, go through that, we're going to see in just a second, you would be pretty much in between the Mycenaean rulers, right? I'm sorry, Mycenaean armies, right? They would be on top of those walls. And here we are, kind of an old photograph, and the image of Heinrich Schliemann is right there at the very top, of course, of, of the image. He's standing right next to this lion gate. And what's interesting is stories tell us that he divorced his first wife because she was not as much of a fanatic as he was with Homer and all things Homer. And apparently in this case, the woman on the rock on the bottom is his second wife, and she was very much into it the way he was. But the thing with Schliemann was that his archaeology was rough. So to find certain layers of cities, he would destroy a lot of other ones. So today archaeologists have this love-hate relationship with him because, they're grateful for the information he did find and kind of shedding light on, this kind of mysterious past. At the same time, archaeologists are upset because he destroyed several other layers just to get to, what he thought was Homer's cities that were mentioned. So kind of a love-hate relationship with him. But of course, kind of a bit of an arrogant, cocky man, and he's right up there, right next to the Lion Gate. So kind of a nice photograph to indicate his character and the work that he was doing and how crazy he pretty much was about it. The architectural features of the Lion Gate also bring in two of the ways we've looked at just recently of how to span a passageway, right? So the first of those is the post and lintel, and you can see how the gate here is formed with these two great monolithic, pieces capped by a lintel, right, which is the horizontal bar that goes across it. And then the corbelled arch or the corbelled vault right above it, above that gate. And the area right in the middle of that where our sculpture is actually found is called the relieving triangle. It's, the area that relieves the weight off of the lintel and therefore called a relieving triangle. What's really engaging here is that, architects and artists had a choice. They could have just left it as an empty spot, right? Because they're not putting heavy rocks there to, make the burden heavier on the lintel. But many of them also chose to put in kind of a slab of stone, right? In this case, it's limestone, in that relieving triangle to kind of use that extra space that's available to be able to make a statement, to be able to comment on, the ruler that's there, his power, or whatever it is. It certainly doesn't add that much weight to the lintel, but it still makes it even, more beautiful, I think, and more interesting, and certainly makes an important message. Look at these lions, right? Front paws lifted up, and they're on either side of what looks like a Minoan column. And that is meant to represent the citadel itself. So it's a symbol of power, these two guardians guarding the citadel, right? The most important part of the Mycenaean civilization, right? This is where their leader was, this is where all kinds of functions and things are taking place. And if you notice, this is a clever part about, shape and decoration or form and subject. It's a relieving triangle, so it's a triangular form. And so the artist has a very clever maneuver here, lifted up the lions on their front paws, thereby causing an incline of their backs, and so beautifully fitting the triangular form that's visible. But this is what they would have seen as soon as they were about to enter, right? Right at the very top, two lions guarding the palace. The tradition of having these powerful guardian figures at gates is certainly not something new for us, right? We've seen it in chapter 2 with the Lamassu, right, of the Assyrian palaces, as well as with the Great Sphinx, which we saw with the pyramid complex in chapter 3. Once again, if you're approaching the citadel, right, you're already impressed with the heavy rocks that are, lining the pathway to the gate. And here's another aerial, a bit of an aerial view, a bit of a different angle for you to see what this place looks like. And you'll notice the doorway is quite narrow, so just maybe about 3 people side by side could have fit through. Certainly not enough or not big enough for an army to storm the citadel and take over. Another area that Schliemann actually excavated was Grave Circle A, and you can see that it's right inside the Lion Gate. So you'd come into the Lion Gate, and on the right side was this what we call now Grave Circle A. Now this one actually predates the Lion Gate and the walls of Mycenae by about 300 years. So there is that gap, but Schliemann at the time did not know of that gap, so he wasn't aware of the things he was finding, that they were earlier than he'd actually anticipated. Here's another aerial view of Grave Circle A, kind of more of a contemporary image that we've been provided, and you can see, what this area looks like. And this is one of the objects that Schliemann actually found. And we're told that when he found it, he actually says things like, "With great joy I announce to you, your majesty, that I have discovered the tombs which tradition proclaims, have indicated it's Agamemnon," and so on and so on. In another instance, he says, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." So here Schliemann, obsessed with Homer, thinking that he's actually holding in his hands the mask, right, that would have been placed on the dead body of Agamemnon. But unfortunately, modern archaeology tells us that this mask is about 1600 to 1500 BC is when it was created. And the Trojan War, if it indeed had happened, would have dated to about 1300 to 1200 BC. So about 300-year gap between what Schliemann thought he was looking at and what this really dates to. But you can see one of the important things here to note is that the Mycenaeans, like the Egyptians, were actually creating creating these masks for their dead rulers. And here's King Tut's death mask that you've seen before, just to make that connection, kind of reinforce that connection. So this speaks to the wealth of the Mycenaeans, right? And also to the belief in some kind of an afterlife. Again, we don't know what that is, but just because kind of seeing the rulers buried with these death masks is pretty indicative of something that came afterwards, right? Some kind of belief in something that would, be waiting for them once they, ended their earthly life. The technique that's been used here is actually called repoussé, which means hammering it from the back. So they would have had this gold sheet and would have hammered it from the back, right? And this is pretty much a construction of this. And then would have come up to the front side and added some of the details like the eyebrows and the hair and so on. But let's look at him. Here's a man with a beard, a mustache, long, narrow, straight nose, wide lips, wide mouth. Eyes are closed, right? This is a dead ruler. Thin lips. Now, is it a portrait? Is it meant to represent individual personality or individual features? We're not really sure. Now, in some other instances, there are some that are not bearded. So that makes us assume that, maybe they were really trying to capture a little bit of the qualities, at least, of the dead ruler. But you certainly see this kind of very regal, royal, majestic depiction of a ruler that we find here. Besides a gold mask, Schliemann did also find a bunch of daggers in the grave. And so you can see all of these various examples here. Now these are inlaid with gold, silver, and niello. And niello is basically that shiny black metallic finish that you can find. So right there we also have another instance of kind of the sophistication of technique, right? Artistic technique with the Minoans. Here is a specific one that we're looking at, the inlaid dagger blade with a lion hunt from Grave Circle A. This is one of the ones on your info sheet. As this indicated, it's a lion hunt, right? So it's kind of this topic that you've seen before. And if you recall, it was with the Assyrians that we've seen these lion hunts. And here is the relief from the North Palace wall, just to remind you about that. So you want to think about what did it represent here, right? The ideas of status, power, military might, ferociousness, fighting off the uncivilized, barbaric intrusions into civilized culture. All of those that are indicated with the Assyrian reliefs that we believe might also be going on with the Mycenaean daggers. Let's look at the work a little bit more closely. It's a lion hunt, and you have four individuals that are represented, one of whom has already been charged by the lions and is already laying horizontally on the ground. And the three on the left still fighting, kind of, veering forward to attack the lions. Now, two of the lions are fleeing, right, on the right side of the dagger, but one of them is still very much charging against the Mycenaeans, right, the Mycenaean warriors in this case. So you've got a very animated, active charge scene here, and it might remind you a little bit of the Minoans. What are some of those features that remind us of Minoan culture? Well, the figure types, right? We mentioned about the body shapes, the broad shoulders, the narrow pinched waist, the long hair, right? These kind of muscular legs. So we see that in the Mycenaean forms as well. Also, the shape of the lion of the dagger is very much reminiscent of the bull in the bull leaping fresco, with the elongated body meant to indicate this charging, fearsome force that's coming up. We also have the double shield that the Mycenaean warriors are using in the daggers, very similar to the image in the bottom right of the Knossos Palace, where we have this double shield symbol in one of the rooms. And actually, there are several other hallways that are aligned with these, and that are lined up with these double shields. And of course, the dynamic, active nature of the dagger is also very much reminiscent of the Minoan love for lively, active, dynamic scenes of motion and energy and activity. So we're seeing these connections, and we do believe they were there. There was connections before the Mycenaeans actually came onto Crete. Before that, there were connections between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. So it's not strange that we see these artistic similarities that also speak to the similarities among the cultural connections. So we come to the question again, what does this object tell us about the Mycenaeans, and maybe even specifically about the Mycenaean kings? Well, it speaks of their wealth, it speaks of their power, it gives us information about their burial practices. So the death mask is one, the daggers is another object that was buried with them. It speaks to us about their warlike nature, right? Just the fact that they have weapons buried with them is certainly significant. And then we have the lion hunt depicted on the weapon. That's another indication of their kind of aggressive, warlike nature. We also are aware now of their artistic sophistication by using niello, and we've earlier seen repoussé. So certainly seeing all of these features. And another really important one that we can't bypass is the cosmopolitan aspect of Mycenaean civilization. In other words, the figure types here are very Minoan, but the idea of a lion hunt is very much from Mesopotamia. So you're seeing the merging of these kind of cultural ideas and forms that are coming together. Now, somebody might ask, well, who was a patron? Who was a person who would have wanted something like this? Probably made by a Minoan metal worker for the Mycenaean ruler, who might have liked Minoan art but preferred the Mesopotamian subject of lion hunts, right? So we're really seeing this cosmopolitan nature of Mycenaean civilization with this dagger. War was also captured in another object. Here we have our warrior vase from Mycenae. Now this is a crater, and a crater is a bowl for mixing wine or water. And the easiest way I can help you to remember that is think of a crater like a crater on a moon, right? It's a big round open space. But the mouth of a crater that's used for mixing has to be wide and large for you to be able to mix in there. But if it's a narrower mouth, that's often used for, say, for example, pouring liquids or storing liquids. So it's just kind of a distinction to be made, and you'll see some examples at the Getty Center as well, the Getty Villa as well. Now, what's going on here? Well, you have a bunch of soldiers that are marching off to war. They're pretty heavily armored. They're actually wearing the helmet, a boar's tooth helmet that Homer mentions in his texts. They've got their shields and spears and so on, so pretty heavily armored and ready to march off. Towards the left of the image that you see is a woman that bids them farewell. So, her raised hand is, kind of sending them off and bidding them goodbye. Now, there's also a suggestion made about this woman's hand gesture. I mean, we can't see it because that part is broken off, right? The paint's come off. But a suggestion has been made that she might also be pulling out her hair. Now, in these ancient conventions, pulling out of the hair is a sign of grief and mourning. I mean, just such frustration and pain and grieving, right? Deep grieving that you're just pulling out your hair. If that might be what she's doing, almost as a foreshadowing of what would be happening to these soldiers who are going off to war. Another feature of this warrior vase that's important to point out is that there is no setting. We don't know where this is taking place. Think about how different that is in this case from Minoan art, where we do see landscape, and where landscape is a feature and sometimes a feature in and of itself. But in this case, the narrative has been pretty simplified. It's soldiers going off to war, no indication of setting, and only one woman there who bids them farewell. But this is pretty much a good moment to think about what is happening to the Mycenaeans. This object was created in 1200 BC, and the Mycenaean world, as they know it, was about to be drastically changed. What brought about the end of Aegean culture? Although it is a mystery, the suggestion is that something happened around 1200 BC, some kind of catastrophic event, because the Mycenaeans, Hittites, Egyptians, they all mention sea peoples, some kind of invasion by foreigners referred to as sea peoples in several texts. And these people were supposed to be very good on sea, so seafaring, and bringers of war, right? So, what were the cultures that were impacted? Well, we know the Egyptians mentioned them in their hieroglyphics. We have records from Ramses III describing a sea people, quote unquote, that caused a lot of trouble. And he had to fight off different coalitions of people. His victories were represented in, typical Egyptian form, praising the king and so on. But because of this confrontation with the sea people, Egypt was weakened and lost some of its colonies and lost some of its power. We also know that the Hittite capital was sacked and burned around this time. And they had relations with Egypt, so of course that was impacted as well. We also know that the Syrians suffered quite a bit of destruction as well, and one of their powerful cities was taken. This is also the time that Homer tells us that Troy was destroyed. So a lot of connections all related to these sea peoples that have come into this area and have pretty much created chaos specifically for the areas near the coast. Now, what about the people on Crete, or on the island of Crete? What happens to them? Well, what we're told is that we don't see the same kind of activity there, that it doesn't have the same kind of destruction. And apparently the people retreated from the coastal areas, moved inward into more of the mountain areas, and they were harder to access, more difficult to access. So when historians notice this type of movement, they suggest that they were fearful of invaders. Something is happening in the area where the people are afraid of invasion, and it seems to be invasion by sea, right? And then that's supported by the texts that talk about a sea people that are coming in. Now, nobody knows the identity of the sea people. Were they Phoenicians? Were they the Vikings? We don't really know who they are. But what we want to figure out is, how is it that this group of people can create chaos? How is it that they can destroy cities? How is it that they can destroy powerful rulers? And the theory that's been suggested is that they introduced a new type of warfare. It was a new type of sword that started to be used. Also, a lot of the Egyptian reliefs show the enemy fighting on foot with these swords and javelins, and also we realize that when the soldiers are using these swords and javelins, they can disable a chariot by either killing or wounding the horse or cutting the reins. So they've introduced a new type of warfare, which then indicates and explains their success at destroying all these other rulers and cities and so on. So what happens to the Greek world after this catastrophe? Well, with the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces around 1200 BC, this mainland Greece goes into a dark age. Painting, carving, building, even writing seem to have disappeared. And most of the Mycenaean sites are destroyed except for Athens. We know from ancient sources that Athens actually survives, and archaeology does confirm this. And that's where we're going to pick up pretty much in chapter 5 is with the Athenians and what's going on. But when we go into chapter 5 and we talk about the historical Greeks, what we want to know is they did look on the Minoan and the Mycenaean predecessors with awe and wonder and respect, but they surpassed them. And that's what we're going to do in the next chapter.